2 Samuel chapter 11 tonight. Last week we got through 5 verses, so we're setting a high goal for ourselves tonight. So, if you would, turn in your Bible to the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel chapter 11. For those of you who weren't here last week, we get kind of in-depth. If it gets too heavy, if I lose you, just raise your hand. I won't change, but at least it'll make you feel better. All right, 2 Samuel chapter 11, we're going to start in verse 6. A little bit of a recap. What happened in the first 5 verses? David did bad. That's all last week summed up in 4 words. David did bad. We hear that a lot in church, don't we? Hey, you weren't here last week. He had to deal with all the David stuff last week. All right, last week, David saw something he shouldn't have, which led him into doing something he shouldn't have. And now we're coming to the problem time. So, 2 Samuel 11, verse 6. First part of verse 6. And David sent to Joab. Now, the first thing here is David has committed a horrible sin. He's taken a woman who is not his wife and has lain with her, and she is now pregnant. Now, David could have been a man about this. I mean, come on. David was the king. David was not one to shirk from what he needed to do. I mean, this is the same David who, as a small boy, stood up to Goliath. This is the same David who, as a young child, what did he fight off when he was a shepherd? Lion. I mean, come on, if you're a little kid and you kill a lion, that makes you pretty tough, right? But David isn't that David right now. He's not that David anymore. He could have been a man, he could have done the right thing, and he could have gone directly to Uriah, but he doesn't. Verse 6, the first part says, and David sent to Joab. David doesn't even want to deal with Uriah. He goes above Uriah. He goes over Uriah's head. David did not even have the courage to face the man at this point that he had so wronged. So he sends for the commander of his forces. Now, I don't know. I've never fought a war, but I kind of think that if you're out there and you're trying to besiege a city, you're trying to take over a city, probably the last thing that you need to worry about is your king coming up and telling you to do something extra. I mean, is that a safe assumption? I'll be honest. If I'm out taking care of my yard, I don't even want Candy to come up and tell me to do something else. So David is not only shirking the responsibility here, he's also complicating things, not just for him, not just for Bathsheba, but for his army as well. Second part of verse 6 says, saying, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. David could have just said, hey, Uriah, come home for a little bit. I need to talk to you. But no. David went through the supreme commander and said, send me Uriah the Hittite. Do you notice how hands-off David is being in this situation? He's trying to involve as many other people as he can. He's trying not to be directly involved. Now, what got David in this mess to begin with? Being hands-on, basically. I mean, sin. So now, David is trying to do things a little bit differently. Well, at this point, the supreme commander, Joab, who's fighting this battle, and we can tell from the scripture passage here, it was a pretty intense battle. I mean, this was not okay, we're going to shoot an arrow now, and that's going to be the war for today. Everybody go home to your tent. This was a pretty intense thing. Joab gets this messenger, and the messenger says, King David wants Uriah the Hittite. Joab's like, okay, I have no idea what's going on here. Uriah's one of my better men, but fine, king wants, king gets. So Joab sends Uriah out. Do you think at this time Joab had any cause to doubt or any type of second thoughts about his king? Y'all can answer me. Come on. He seems to be all right now. We'll come back to that idea in a little bit. Verse 7. And when Uriah was come unto him, how long do you think the time frame of all this is? Weeks? A hot minute? Let's talk biology here for a minute. Before we had the wonderful Kmart, or wonderful Walmart, it took people a while to figure out if they were pregnant or not, didn't it? Yeah, we're probably talking at least a month before Bathsheba figured out she was pregnant. Because what did we talk about last week? What was she doing bathing? She was purifying herself. So probably an entire month has passed. And if we're really honest with ourselves, we are talking about ancient Israel right now. Did they have the internet? No. Did they have phones? They might have had faxes, Tie a note to a fox and send them running off in the field or something? No. Communication back then was all done on foot. You sent runners out. Now, if we can safely assume that Bathsheba took her at least a month to figure out something was wrong. And then it probably took her a little bit more time to communicate back and forth with David about the situation. Now, David probably didn't immediately send a messenger out. He probably took a little while to think about what he was going to do. I feel safe in saying that Uriah has been sent for probably about 2 months after all this has gone down. The message in that is very simple. When we commit a sin, do the problems begin immediately, or do they have a way of waiting a while till we think they're all gone and then jumping out and biting us? That's one of the great tricks the devil plays on us. He tempts us. And when we give in to that temptation, it's great and it's wonderful. And then we wash our hands and we think nothing's wrong and we go about our daily lives. Only to a little while later, when we've forgotten about it, it jumps back up and reminds us that we have done wrong. So, probably, and this is Pastor Trey, this is me, this is my guess. It's not listed in here exactly, but this is my educated guess. Probably at least 2 months have gone down since all this started. Which begs the question, what do you think Uriah knew at this point? Do you think he had any idea of what was going on? All right, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into this. Have you all ever dived this deep into this story before? What did the court of King David have to do on a daily basis? If you were an attendant to King David, what did you do? Just like an attendant to any other king, you sat around and you waited for the king to call you and tell you to do something. Now, if we have a bunch of people sitting around with nothing to do, what do you think is going to happen? Gossip. And ladies, forgive me, but Lord help King David if he had some female attendants that only had to sit around. Oh, I got some dirty looks from that one. Men are just as bad, if not worse. Yeah. This is going to come into play in a minute, but think about this. We talked about this last week. Did David know Bathsheba right away? If you remember, he had to ask people, who is this woman? And after asking, who is this woman, what did he do? Did he go and get this woman? He sent people to get her. Now, let's be honest, too. After they did whatever they did, do you think she was able to sneak out of the palace, the greatest place in all of Israel, without being seen by a few other people? It's safe to say that there was more than one or two people that knew Bathsheba had been in there and had been up to no good. It's interesting to think, what kind of rumors were started. And that's going to come into play in a few verses, but we'll get back to that. So Uriah comes in. We have no idea what he knows and what he doesn't know. But it's very interesting. The second part of verse 7 shows us David's reaction to Uriah standing in front of him. Second part of verse 7 reads, David demanded of him. Okay, right there. Is that a happy word? What kind of image does that bring up in your mind when we use the word demanded? Don't have a choice, authority. Do you ever like being demand? Do you ever like having someone demand something of you? You like that? No, you're shaking your head yes. Do you think David is trying to show dominance over Uriah right now? Demanding of him. Demanding, I am your king. Because let's be honest, when you stand in the presence of a king, do you stand? What's the first thing that you do? You give the king the respect. You kneel, you bow, you some way acknowledge that he is in a position that is higher than you. Usually good protocol in the Bible, if you read, if the king is in a good mood, he will accept you and the conversation will go on as normal. Right here, the first way that this word is used, and I know I'm making a lot of this word, but this verse has a lot to do with words and the words that are used. More to that to come. David is demanding of Uriah. First thing he says is, demanded of him how Joab did, and how the people did, and how the war prospered. Let's be honest here. Does David care about Joab? Does David care about the people? Does David even care about the war? Slightly. If David really cared about the war, would he be in his palace or would he be out on the battlefield? But he doesn't see that anymore. It's very interesting. If we look at this in the original Hebrew, the word choice that David used is very, very galling. In the original Hebrew, the word that David uses when dealing with Joab and the people is salom. Salom is the Hebrew word for peace. He asked Uriah the Hittite, how is the peace of Joab? He asked Uriah the Hittite, how is the peace of the people? Do you see how perverse that word is in this situation?
I think he was more concerned with that, the problem he had.
He was, but this is going to come up again later. David likes to think that David is smarter than David is. You know people like that think they're smarter than they actually are and they try to talk themselves out of something?
I think it's saying that he wants to feel like he's in total control of the situation. And he's maneuvered himself to handle the sin, cover it up, and deal with it his way.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very ironic that he uses the word peace for a situation that is anything but peaceful by his own hand. It's very hypocritical in my book. But like you said, David is trying to set this up, like David does throughout this entire story. David is trying to control the situation. And friends, let's be honest. What do we do with things when we control them? We mess them up. What do we do when we let God do his thing? It works out a lot better, doesn't it? All right, we're going to move on. Okay, and David, demands of Uriah, how are things going, all this. Do we have any record of the response Uriah gave? Do you read that in your Bible anywhere? Nope. You ever heard the old saying, the victor is the one who writes history? History is written by the conquerors. I think David had a lot of hand in the way this story played out, even though it's not flattering. Because even though, David admits his sin later on, we don't have a response from Uriah here. Whatever Uriah says, David doesn't care. The author of this book doesn't care. For we jump from David demanding of Uriah to David saying to Uriah in verse 8, David said to Uriah, go down to thy house. This is why Uriah came in the first place, right? David didn't care about what was going on, or he cared a little bit. But his main purpose of having Uriah there was for what? Cover up his sin. So he says, Uriah, you traveled all this way. You've been out in the field for a while. Why don't you go to your house? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it doesn't end there. David says to him in the second part of verse 8, and wash your feet. What does that mean? No. That is a very specific meaning. If you look, you don't have to do it now, but if you look in Ezekiel 16:25, it is very clearly spelled out what that meant. That meant go home and do what you do on your honeymoon. That was a euphemism in Israel at that time. Go home and wash your feet was code word for going home and being man and wife. So not only does David say go home, he says, go home and while you're at home, go sleep with your wife. David's probably smiling right now because he thinks, man, I've got this covered. This is under wraps. He's going to go home, he's going to sleep with his wife, and then nobody will be able to say a word. I always kind of wonder what David would have done if Uriah had done that and the kid came out looking just like David. Oh well. The last part of verse 8. Uriah departed out of the king's house, and there followed him a mess of meat from the king. How many of you had meat for dinner? I don't know those hot dogs. I don't know what was in them, but it was some form of meat. I had meat for lunch. I didn't have meat for breakfast, but I would have liked it. And honestly, if I'm going to have a midnight snack later, it's probably going to be some form of meat. We don't think anything of eating meat, do we? We get hungry, we go down to Burger King. I'm sorry. We get hungry, we go to whatever there is in Vass besides Subway. Not yet. I'm watching it every day, though. We don't have a problem going somewhere and getting some meat to eat because we live in an affluent time and we are affluent people. In the time of King David, meat was reserved for only those who were very well off. Meat was not a common occurrence. You were lucky to get meat once, really extremely lucky to get meat twice a week. King David here is trying to dupe Uriah into doing what he wants Uriah to do. So not only does he tell him to go home, not only does he tell him to go and be with his wife, he sends a feast home so that Uriah will have a party and will more than likely do exactly what David wants him to do. David is gifting him this so that it can meet David's needs. Not because Uriah is a good soldier, not because Uriah deserves it, but because David wants to cover up for who? Himself. We're actually going to get how good he is here in a second. Verse 9. Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord and went not down to his house. How do you think David felt when he woke up and he saw Uriah laying at his front door? I know the Simpsons hadn't been invented yet, but I'm sure David went, don't. There's one or two Simpsons fans in here. After Uriah left, David had probably convinced himself that his plan had worked. He was convinced that he had outsmarted God himself. But what happens when we think we outsmart God? God has a real good way of reminding us that he's smarter than us, doesn't he? David got up, stretched, had whatever beverage they had early in the morning. And there was Uriah laying at the front door. I think David got kind of mad at this point, because you read in the next verse. The servants came and told David, saying, Uriah went not down into his house. David got upset. The next says, David said unto Uriah, camest not thou from thy journey? Why then did thou not go down unto thine house? David said, you came all the way from the battlefield. You've been out there fighting for months. You took this long journey. You hadn't even seen your wife in I don't know how long. And here's the opportunity to go lay down in your own house. Y'all ever go off on a trip for a couple days or a week or so? No matter how nice the hotel is, no matter how nice wherever you're staying is there anywhere as nice as your own bed? David was like, why don't you go to your own bed for a couple of nights? Man, this is a treat. Take advantage of it. Look at verse 11. This is the only thing Uriah says in this entire passage. But look what he says. And Uriah said unto David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are encamped in the open fields. Shall I then go into mine house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As thou livest and as thy soul liveth, I will not do this thing. There's a lot going on in this verse. Is there any respect that Uriah shows to King David about who he is right here?
I think he feared God more than he did King David.
That's going to come up in a second, Lewis. You're jumping ahead of me, but good thought. First thing Uriah says to David, the ark and Israel and Judah abide in tents. Now, there's two things we need to look at here. Number one, they were out doing battle. Do soldiers build houses when they're out in battle? No, they usually, sleep in tents or whatever. Interestingly enough, though, it was thought, and it has been said that during this time it was the Feast of Tabernacles. Have you ever heard about the Feast of Tabernacles? One of the tenets of the Feast of Tabernacles was that the Israelite people were supposed to not stay in their house. They were supposed to go out and live for 1 week in shelters made of sticks or twigs or whatever. But for 1 week, they were not supposed to sleep in their house. If this was the week of tabernacles, if this was the festival of tabernacles, we see a compounding of David's sin and an uplifting of Uriah's holiness in that. For if it is this festival week, David's not only sinned against his man, he's not only sinned against God, but now he's sinning against God again by not following the rules, right? Sin leads to more sin. It leads to more sin. It leads to more sin, doesn't it? Ooh. Very interesting, he says, my lord Joab. How does Uriah refer to his commander? With a lot of respect. He should have had respect for the king, but interesting, that's not recorded here. One other thing, and then we'll move on from this. The Old Testament says that when the Israelites go to war, and it is a holy war, they are supposed to act differently. Soldiers in the field have a command. There are several commands, most of them found in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, that spell out exactly what a soldier in God's army, in God's battle, was supposed to do. Do you want to know how specific that is? Deuteronomy 23, that 23rd chapter, spells out to the soldiers in God's army about how they're supposed to go to the bathroom when they're camped in the Lord's camp. You catch that? They have a tool to go out, dig a hole, do their business, and cover it back up. Do you know why that is? Well, number one, it's just basic good sanitation right there. Because you got a bunch of men living together in tight quarters, disease usually follows unless you keep sanitized. But the real reason for this was the Bible says that at night in the camp of God's army, God himself walks through that camp. So the men were supposed to keep themselves clean, and they were supposed to keep themselves holy. Now think about this. God's soldier, when in battle, was supposed to abstain from anything that made him unclean. What did we talk about last week with Bathsheba being unclean? You know something else that makes a man unclean? Having relations with a woman. That, according to the Bible, makes him unclean. So Israelite soldiers were forbidden from having relations with women while a battle was taking place. So Uriah the Hittite is doing exactly what God has commanded the people to do, isn't he? And King David, the man after God's own heart, is anybody even keeping track of how many rules King David is breaking up to this point? Yeah, I mean, I swear, David's just going down the list, marking them off as he gets them.
I can't help but believe, too, it's starting to eat him alive.
Oh, yeah, that's what we're coming to now. Before we get to that, though, Terrell, there's two things I want to bring up. Does anybody know what David's name means? Beloved. Like I said, he was, a man after God's own heart. But that other four-letter L word that sounds a lot like love, is that what got him in trouble, though, wasn't it? Do you know what Uriah means? That's a tough one right there. I actually know a kid named Uriah, by the way. He's the wonderful person that ran into my wife's car. Anyway, Uriah's name literally means, my light is Yahweh. Uriah's name means, my light, my guiding force is God. Uriah kind of lives up to that name in his response, doesn't he? It's kind of sad, and you could probably say this about modern times. It's very sad when the normal people have to show the leaders what it means to be a right and proper man. I won't get into any more on that. Verse 12. After Uriah has spent the night on the doorstep, David gets up and says, David said to Uriah, tarry here today also, and tomorrow I will let thee depart. Why did David want to keep him one more day?
He got to figure something out.
He got to scheme something else up right quick, don't he? He's got to come up with an emergency plan. So Uriah abode in Jerusalem that day and the morrow. Did Uriah have a choice in this matter? No, I mean, your king tells you to do something, and Uriah, obviously, is a good soldier and a good follower. He does exactly what his king says. Verse 13. When David had called him, he did eat and drink before him, and he made him drunk. You know, Uriah had a very strong reservation about not going and being with his wife. He absolutely point blank refused to do that. He did not, however, refuse getting drunk. The regulations about drinking and soldiers in battle, obviously they weren't there, or Uriah didn't listen to that part because, yeah, we can infer from the scripture that I think the term is Uriah probably got ripped roaring drunk. Because I'm pretty sure David said to his wine bearer, the kings had a guy whose only job it was to take care of the wine and to fill it in. I'm sure David said to the wine bearer, you go down to the basement, if they had a basement. You know where the wine is, you get the best stuff, and you see that Uriah right there, his cup gets a little bit of space in it, you pour the good stuff in there, because I want him completely drunk.
Would it have also been an insult if he didn't drink and he
that continued?
Yeah.
Well, he was probably stressed out too, because what he knew had happened.
Yeah, and, let's be honest. He's drinking the king's wine here, too. This is a rabbit, but it's a very interesting rabbit. About 6 months ago, I believe, the Israelite archaeological people unearthed some clay pots that had an inscription on it, the wine of King David. And it had some serial information underneath it, where it was and where it was from and when it was made. And these are actual pottery shards that they found in Israel this past sometime in 2013. So, talk about David using wine to get Uriah drunk, and here this past year archaeologists have found shards of pottery that were from David's wine collection. I just think that's pretty cool. I mean, people always try to disprove the Bible, and archaeology is always finding evidence of what's in the Bible. So, just a little rabbit. Okay, last part of verse 13. And at evening he went out to lie on his bed and with the servants of his Lord, but went not down to his own house. I don't know how drunk Uriah was, but he still wasn't drunk enough to go to his own house. Maybe he was just a little bit tipsy and he had enough sense not to go to his house, or maybe he was so drunk he couldn't make it out the front door. I don't know. Any way you cut it, he didn't go home. David saw that. I think David got really upset at this point, because David goes from trying to do something that's not that bad to what? Murder. Verses 14 and 15. And it came to pass in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, Set ye Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retire ye from him, that he may be smitten and die. This is a very common theme in ancient literature, that a soldier carries his own death warrant. We see this in several other accounts from ancient times. Very safe to assume that David was literate. David could read and write. I mean, obviously, came up with Psalms, things like that. David could read and write. Joab is the supreme commander of David's army. Very safe to assume that he could read and write as well. That was a position where you had to be educated. You had to be able to read and write to be a commander of that large an army. Uriah the Hittite probably had no idea how to read, because that was a very complex task, and that was something that only very special people learned. Added into that, even if Uriah could read, the practice of the day was when a king sent a scroll or a king sent a message, he would roll it up and he would take his signet, either his ring or a special stamp, and put a seal over that so that it could only be broken by the person who it was intended to read. Do you know the punishment in ancient days for breaking the king's seal if you weren't the one who you were intended to? Death. So even if Uriah could read, he couldn't read it or he would die. David probably hoped he would break the seal anyway, but David tells Joab the commander, you put Uriah in the worst possible spot, and add to that, when he's in the worst possible spot, you pull all your men back so that Uriah dies. What do we call it when we arrange the premature death of someone nowadays? Oh, I just call it murder. So, murder. David's sin is compounding with interest now, isn't it? Goes from a little dalliance to murder.
You know, I can't help but think this up here is kind of human. You ever heard that saying, it says, oh, what a tangle, web we weave.
That's very true.
Practice, did you see?
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what's going on.
It reminds me of a bait caster reel. Anybody ever use a bait caster reel? Yeah, you do something wrong with that. You know, if you have like an open face reel or something like that and you cast it wrong, there's a little bit of a knot. If you have a bait caster and you do something wrong, you just throw it away. There's no one doing that knot. It's kind of like the sin that David had, but I digress. Verses 16, and it came to pass when Joab observed the city that he signed Uriah unto a place where he knew the valiant men were. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and there fell some of the people of the servants of David, and Uriah the Hittite died also. How many people are going to die because of what David did? You got Uriah the Hittite, several unnamed soldiers, and later on, the child that he and Bathsheba have. Does sin ever hurt just one person? Why do we sin? A little pleasure to us, but a lot of pain to a lot more people. It's interesting. David's note says for Joab just to kill Uriah. But do you know what would have happened if Joab had killed just Uriah? It would have been pretty obvious. The soldiers under Joab's command were pretty smart. They knew if Joab sent just Uriah to the front of the battle, to the wall, to fight by himself, that would have been extremely odd. And they would have asked a lot of questions of Joab. Why did you just send him? So Joab, in order to cover his own butt, sends not only Uriah, but several other soldiers to the wall to the most intense fighting. And Uriah and all of those soldiers wind up dying. Sad how innocent people have to suffer, isn't it? That's another thing that we're going to come back to in this whole story, how the innocents suffer. KJ, you shut the back door? The wind's getting it. Okay, verse 18. Joab sent and told David all the things concerning the war. And he charged the messenger, saying, when thou hast made an end of telling the matters of the war unto the king, and if it so be that the king's wrath arise, and he say unto thee, wherefore approach ye so nigh unto the city, and why ye did fight? Know ye not that they would shoot from the wall? Who smote Amalek, the son of Jerusalem? Well, that was even hard for me, so give me. Did not a woman cast a piece of millstone upon him from the wall, that he died in Thebez? Why went ye not the wall? Then say thou, thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. Joab is practicing this wonderful thing that we all do, covering his butt. He sent word saying, some of your troops have died. And David, David was going to be upset because David, despite all his faults, was a decent military commander at one point. He said, why'd you get so close to the wall? You know what happens when you get close to the wall. They've got guys up there with bows and arrows. They're going to shoot those at you. They got people up there with large rocks they're going to throw down on your head. They got people up there with slings that are going to sling rocks at you. The whole point of a siege is to stay outside of the danger zone and starve the city into submission. Joab knew David was going to be upset that he did such a boneheaded move. So he says to the messenger, if he gets mad, tell him Uriah the Hittite is dead. What do you think that little sentence at the end did to David's anger? I'll come back to that side note if I've got time. Verse 22. The messenger went and came and showed David all that Joab had sent him for. And the messenger said to David, surely the men prevailed against us and came out unto us in the field, and we were upon them even unto the evening of the gate. And the shooters shot from off the wall upon thy servants, and some of the king's servants be dead, and thy servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger goes and he says, we got too close, some people died, Uriah is dead. Verse 25. I've had biblical Hebrew. There's a few times that it would really benefit y'all. This is one of those verses that if you could read it in the original language, it would make the whole world a difference. Verse 25 in the King James says, David said unto the messenger, thus shalt thou say unto Joab, let not this thing displease thee, for the sword devoureth one as well as another. Make thy battle more strong against the city, and overthrow it, and encourage thou him. In the original Hebrew, the translation is David says, "Do not let this be evil in your eyes." Do you see the great irony in that? Do not let this be evil in your eyes. Who is David telling that to? Himself. David is trying to cast this as not a sin, as not a bad thing. Do not let this seem like evil. He's finally gotten what he wants. His problem, Uriah, is dead. Verse 26, and when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. Back in the day, when someone you loved died, you mourned them for 7 days. After 7 days, you went on about your life. David probably mourned Uriah as well. Wasn't the first time David had to mourn for somebody who either was out to get him or somebody David didn't like. David mourned for Saul, he mourned for Abner, and he mourned for Ishabel. David was getting pretty good at this whole appearing to be sorry thing. After the mourning was past, verse 27, David sent and fetched her to his house, and she became his wife and bare him a son. So probably 2.5 months after all this happened, David gets married to Bathsheba. Okay, Uriah is dead. Several innocent soldiers are dead. David's gone through a lot of trouble. Word's probably spread around. And let's be honest, verse 27, when the mourning was past, David sent and fetched her to his house. So probably it was day 8 after Uriah died, and they found out that David married Bathsheba. Does that ever happen around here? Somebody die and then the person gets married a couple months later? Do we say nice things about that, or are we honest? It's like, Yeah, we wonder about that. Imagine if it happened 8 days after the death of somebody's husband. Yeah. At this point, I am sure David thought he was done. He got rid of the evidence. He married the woman that had gotten all this mess. He probably thought everything was going to be okay. He had a brand new baby son. I mean, obviously. Let's do some math here. How long you been like that? Yep. You got another month to go, don't you? So David lived with Bathsheba for a while. I love the way this chapter ends. Last part of verse 27. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord.
Well, I can't help but think that David knows he's lying to David.
I don't know. You reach that point where you lie to yourself so much that you believe it. No matter how great a person you may be. We all know people who we thought were great and wonderful, but they lied to themselves so much that they convinced themselves that the lie was the truth. If you are human, you are susceptible to that.
He's supposed to be a man of faith, though, he knows he's different.
I hate to say it, but I know plenty of men of faith who still messed up. And in their eyes, thought they did no wrong. And let's be honest, that's the most dangerous man of all, isn't it? Months, at least 9 months had passed since the beginning of this psalm. And David probably thought he was happy. David probably thought it was all over. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. I'm going to let you go in a minute, but I do want to tell you this. God forgives. Amen? But someone still has to pay that price for our sin. I think sometimes we forget that even though we are saved, that even though we may be good Christians, those times when we rebel, that's still putting Jesus on the cross. There's no such thing as a victimless crime. And unfortunately, there's no such thing as a sin that does not go unpunished. Whether we get the punishment we rightly deserve, or whether Christ on the cross takes it for us, the result of sin is always suffering. Always. Maybe not for us, but always for someone. Think about that. Think about that next time you're tempted. You may think you can be like David and get away for a while, but somebody's going to have to pay. But thankfully, that's not where this story ends. We got a few more weeks before we get to the wonderful part, but we still got some more to go. So, we'll stop here for the night. Questions, comments? Y'all were quiet tonight, Joe.
Reading David's writings and his life and everything, I believe most of his enemies were within him. When he speaks about his enemies, it always just seems like it reflects that they're within him.
David, you ever want to see how David really was? How many of you know the 23rd Psalm? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me lie down beside green pastures. Wonderful, very reassuring, right? How does the 22nd Psalm start? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? So David in chapter 22 of Psalm says, God, why have you left me? To the next chapter, you are so good, you are such a provider. David was a roller coaster, up and down. You can find great comfort in your own life with that because we mirror that a lot in our own spiritual life, don't we? All right. Thank you, Joe. Anybody else?
About that video of the Bible. It's got 4 segments in it.
Uh-huh.
And we just watched exactly what you was talking about, everything that happened from day one to the end.
I'm so mad at that series right now. They're doing Jesus, the life of Jesus. They got rid of the devil because of all the outcry over that. They said the devil looked too much like the president. I'm not making that up. I say things happen for a reason, but hey. All right, next week, we'll look at what David has to go through when he's convicted. So, all right, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father God, thank you for being awesome. Thank you for loving us. Thank you for caring about us. But most of all, dear God, we thank you with all that we are because you took our place. You suffer for our sin. Thank you for loving us that much. Lord, my prayer is that as we go out into the world, as we go out into our lives, that we would remember how much you love us, and that at some point this week, we might be able to come just a little bit close to mirroring that love for you in our lives. Help us this week, dear Lord, to be who you would have us to be. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.